Good afternoon. Today's Korea Society policy program is titled After the U.S. Presidential Election, Gauging the Results for Korea and Northeast Asia. My name is Tom Byrne, and I'm President and CEO of the Korea Society. The election is not over, but it is closing towards completion, with Biden apparently edging towards the Electoral College threshold for victory, while the Republicans are eyeing to maintain their hold on the Senate. We would like to provide you with a rapid response to help shed insight and clarity on future policy scenarios. We are fortunate to be joined by two speakers with demonstrated expertise in the policymaking process of Washington, D.C. and the subject of foreign policy and Korea, Keith Luse and Frank Jannuzi. Both served long and distinguished tenures as senior staff members in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Keith Luse is now Executive Director of the National Committee on North Korea, and Frank Jannuzi is now President and CEO of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. I believe both of us are joining us from Washington, D.C. The Korea Society team is grateful to the Korea Foundation, whose ongoing support helps make programs like this possible. Our two speakers join Korea Society Senior Director Stephen Noerper for today's discussion. We will welcome your questions, so please send those now and throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. Stephen, the screen's yours.
Tom, thank you. And thank you to the over 300 people who have registered for today's discussion. We're grateful to have you on board. Thank you as well to Frank Jannuzi and to Keith Luse, two outstanding analysts, as you will hear, two insiders who have interesting reflections on the way Washington works and how this may be coming together, and two of the kindest people in the field of Asian studies. As you will see, their good humor and their sharp insights are warm and most welcome. We're delighted to have them back. They were last with us in an analysis of Singapore summit and what had happened there between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And they're back with us today to talk about the potential shifts with a Biden administration likely incoming, though we may touch on potential Trump 2 issues as well. But let me begin with Frank Jannuzi. Frank, thanks. Nice to have you in from the Mansfield Foundation and all your supporters who are joining us online. We know we have NCNK supporters, and we know we have supporters from Columbia University's APEC Study Center today. So thanks for the various constituencies and to the Mansfield Center. And Frank Jannuzi, some initial insights on what we're dealing with, and we'll turn to Keith after.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Tom, good to see you again. Keith as well, always. My comrade for the better part of 12 years in the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I'm actually coming to you from Baltimore, so I have to give a shout out to my hometown now. I'm saving 3 hours a day not commuting to Washington and working out of the home office. And for the audience watching at home, thank you so much for joining us in the Korea Society program. Let me offer up just a few top-level observations about what I expect would be a Biden approach to the Korean Peninsula if in fact he prevails in this election and becomes president. Because I think that there's a lot of expectation in the region that because of the Obama-Biden administration's strategic patient approach to the peninsula, essentially saying to the North Koreans in particular, you need to prove to us credibly that you are sincerely interested in denuclearization and peace before we're going to engage in a very serious process with you towards making that happen. I think there's some concern in the region that a Biden administration would take the same approach, and that might squander an opportunity to build off of the initial opening created in Singapore at the Trump-Kim summit. And so while I cannot speak today for the Biden administration, which first of all doesn't exist, and second of all hasn't designated me as a spokesman, I want to offer just a couple of insights at the top here about what I might expect. And I think the most important observation is that as a senator and as vice president, Biden has placed an enormous value on alliance relationships and partnerships. So any Biden administration approach to the Korean Peninsula would be rooted first in close consultations with Seoul And this is something that Biden showed throughout his entire career of 36 years in the Senate. Keith and I were present when Biden would meet with President Kim Dae-jung or KCIA Director Lim Dong-wan and consult closely on a bipartisan basis with these leaders of South Korea in order to ensure that U.S. approach to the peninsula was closely coordinated with our South Korean allies. And I would expect that that would very much be the hallmark of a Biden approach to the peninsula, rooted first in alliances, starting with South Korea, but including Japan. This is also a lesson that Senator Biden learned from Mike Mansfield, who was a mentor to Biden in his early days in the Senate. And as we all know, Mike Mansfield placed an enormous stock in the importance of U.S. alliance relationships in Asia. And I think the other hallmark would be that Biden understands that diplomacy with North Korea would never be easy, and that it is success in diplomacy with North Korea is the product of a lot of hard spade work, in the trenches. And this is very different than the top-down approach, which offers some advantages in terms of speed and access to top-level North Korean decision makers, but which also, as we've witnessed, I think, with the failure to follow through on the Trump-Kim symmetry, has its disadvantages as well. So I think a Biden approach would be somewhat more traditional, bottom up, a lot of hard spade work, a lot of preparation for engagement, a lot of meetings with allies and then with the North Koreans before you would ever see a Biden-Kim summit. So just two observations about style and priorities and how a Biden might approach the Korean Peninsula differently than Trump, while still attaching importance to the nuclear threat and the peace challenge on the peninsula. And I wanted to offer those up as stylistic differences as we launch our discussion.
Thank you very much, Frank. Keith Luse.
Steve, thank you. Thanks to Tom Byrne and to Steve for the privilege of being here today. And it's great, as always, to be with Frank Jannuzi. And as usual, Frank provided an excellent, concise overview of the topic at hand. I'm going to approach the discussion today in a different way, thinking in terms of building blocks for engagement with North Korea. And I understand what is out there in terms of how the election may be headed, but I would like to couch my remarks in the context of Trump or Biden, either one. If President Trump would happen to be reelected, he already has a foundation in place in terms of engagement. I would anticipate some changes to that foundation. If Vice President Biden becomes president, he's starting from scratch with a new team, a new approach. And it's in that context that I have a set of questions I want to raise, which I believe by virtue of sharing these questions, they will encompass so many of the key points that the next president will have to contend with regarding North Korea. Regarding the Trump approach, if Donald Trump is reelected president with the election behind him, perhaps he will be able to donate more personal time to the North Korea issue. There's been much criticism of his approach to engagement with the North, and I acknowledge that Mr. Trump's approach has not reflected the traditional State Department approach to diplomacy. At the same time, because of his personal diplomacy, because of his personal approach, working to establish a relationship with Kim Jong-un, that has contributed to a lessening of tensions on the peninsula. But I would imagine if Mr. Trump is reelected that we would see some changes in approach. For Biden or Trump, would either of them, will they have the political will to actually implement an agreement, to be steadfast in the implementation of an agreement? Will Biden or Trump bring Congress into the process early? The North Koreans are concerned about signing any agreement with the United States, given our system. We're a democracy, we have elections, leaders change. by bringing Congress into the process earlier on, this would create more assurance to the North Koreans that the United States might, over time, support and implement an agreement. Will Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump have the will to insist upon implementation of an agreement by their own people, by people within the administration? We saw under President George W. Bush, we've seen under President Trump. While the president may say one thing, others around the president will go a different road. And I appreciate that there may be reasons for this, but at the end of the day, it creates confusion on the part of the North Koreans. They don't know what to believe. And it, in fact, is a disincentive. This approach is a disincentive to an enduring agreement. Will the Republicans in the Senate provide operating space to Mr. Biden if he is elected president? Will they provide to Mr. Biden the same consideration they provided to Mr. Trump regarding North Korea? Will Vice President Biden be open to establishing lines of communication with Kim Jong-un? Preliminary indications are that he would be open to that, and as Frank alluded, under a certain structure, a lot of spade work would need to be done in advance. If Biden is elected, what will be the skills and experience composition of his North Korea team? Will his North Korea team include people who've actually been to North Korea or who've met with North Koreans? Will his team include people who are familiar with cultural nuance, denoting differences between North and South Korea? Now, I appreciate that many of you will say, Keith, you're really down in the weeds on this. But this is one of the areas in the past where Frank and I experienced considerable challenge, concern, because we too often we were witness to situations where meanings were distorted or not understood by one side or the other. Who in Biden's team will comprehend South and North viewpoints on unification? Will the Biden administration approach North Korea primarily on denuclearization, or will it be an arms control approach, or combination thereof, if he's elected? Will the Biden policy approach be broader in context? Will it include human rights? Will it include cyber? Will it include Americans unaccounted for from the Korean War? Divided families? Yes, the vice president has already indicated that if he's elected, he will go down that road. If elected, will Vice President Biden support continued humanitarian assistance to the neediest of North Korean citizens by US NGOs? Will the Biden administration support the establishment of a banking channel so that NGOs and the UN will be able to continue to operate inside North Korea, as well as provide monitoring of assistance? Will the Biden administration, if he's elected, recognize the benefits of track twos between Americans and North Koreans? Regarding the US-South Korea alliance, Frank has already commented on this at length. I would simply ask the question, how will the Biden administration, if he's elected, how will the alliance be defined? What will the Biden camp view as the components of the South Korea-US alliance, as well as that with Japan? Now, the vice president has called for a nuclear-free Korean peninsula. What does that mean? What does that mean? And by the way, how many, quote, turns of the screw, end of quote, are South Korea and Japan from developing their respective nuclear weapons? This will clearly be an area that the Biden camp will have to contend with. Let me just conclude by saying that whether Trump or Biden prevail, I believe that in the days ahead, we as a country may be in a better place in dealing with North Korea. President Trump has been helpful in getting tensions lessened by the personal diplomacy. That needs to be followed up if he's reelected by substantive negotiations. People around him must be willing to agree with his approach and that of Steve Biegun as opposed to undercutting them. If in fact Vice President Biden is elected, he's already signaled his willingness to connect with the North Korean leader under certain circumstances. So these are both good indicators and I think positive signs as we hope to engage with North Korea in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. That was a wonderfully rich list of questions that really do give us an outline for discussion and for us to continue asking in coming days. Let me turn to you both really to kick off a bit of discussion that plays to both of your sets of comments. One, since you've invoked the notion of personal diplomacy, which we think of relative to Trump and Kim Jong-un, I'd like to switch it in a different format to that of Joe Biden, if he is likely incoming, and his Yonhap piece, which has received a significant amount of attention. And in that, he seemed to, on a personal level, express a few things. One was to decrease the pressure on Seoul over host nation support and to not turn the screw. Secondly, he also emphasized having been on the DMZ as vice president and the importance of unification for the Korean people. And does that speak to a better prospect for US support of inter-Korean relations and improvements there? And lastly, he noted the Korean American community and their important role, which clearly will play well in Korea. So Frank, maybe you could start with some insights on that.
Sure. I was with Biden on his first visit to the DMZ when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2001. And his personal commitment to the alliance, I think, is very strong. And I have no doubt but that he would seek to swiftly bring the negotiations over South Korea's contributions, financial contributions to support of US forces to a speedy conclusion, based largely on the idea that the alliance is mutually beneficial, and it's not a transactional relationship where the United States is running a protection racket. Unfortunately, that has sometimes been the attitude that seems to have been brought from the Trump White House to these talks. For sure, South Korea needs to help support the U.S. troop presence, but this alliance is one based on mutual benefit, and Biden spoke to that not just in his Yonhap piece, but he's lived it. In terms of his commitment to the alliance. His recognition of the importance of Korean immigration to the United States was illustrated by a resolution that he drafted back in 2003, commemorating the anniversary of the beginning of that immigration from Korea to Hawaii, and then later to the United States. So Biden's approach, I think, to Korea is rooted in this gratefulness for the contribution that Korea has made for U.S. interests. And going to Keith's question about what kind of an alliance, I think Moon Jae-in talked about an alliance of peace. Prime Minister Abe came to Congress and spoke about an alliance of hope. I think that the United States alliances in Northeast Asia are in transition from purely threat-based deterrent relationships, preventing Soviet aggression, holding back North Korean aggression, to alliances that are going to be more global in scope and more comprehensive in their ambition in terms of advancing international norms. And so I would expect that kind of an alliance would be more enduring and sustainable than an alliance based only on the prospect of deterring North Korean aggression. And I think that's also where the South Korean people are headed, because they're looking around at South Korea's place in the world, and they see a value in having a US partner who can work hand in hand with Korea on issues as diverse as climate change to pandemic response to promoting a free and open global trading system. So I would expect that would be the style that Biden would bring to alliance management, and that would probably be very welcome in Seoul, where clearly the Korean people want to take a larger share of both, I think, the burden for their self-defense, but also authority and decision-making power, whether it's issues of OPCON transfer or leadership of the peace and denuclearization process on the peninsula.
Thank you, Frank. Keith, one question that I was asked on Arirang television today was, do we anticipate a downtick in North Korea's relevancy? And there seemed to be this assumption that because there wouldn't necessarily be face-to-face meetings between the leaders right off, a la Trump and Kim Jong-un, that would represent a downtick. My reply was, I don't think concern about the North Korean challenges are going anywhere. How do you see North Korea, Keith, in the equation going forward? And you mentioned in your questions about the agreeability of a Republican-controlled Senate. Do you think that they, will be working with President Biden, if that's what we have as the outcome, if there is movement toward peace regime or an end of war statement and other types of peace reinforcements on the Korean Peninsula?
When the question is posed as to the relevance of North Korea to the United States, to the Trump administration, or to a Biden administration, in comparison to all the other issues and challenges in the world, I think context is important. A new president is going to be faced with an ongoing pandemic in the United States, a global crisis as relates to pandemic. The good news here is that Kim Jong-un today knows that he not only has direct access to Donald Trump, but he knows that Vice President Biden has indicated a willingness to also develop a relationship or to be in communication. That is positive. And I believe that assurance in itself on the part of both American leaders, Trump and Biden, this will go a long way towards setting the possible stage for constructive engagement between the United States and North Korea. The North Koreans are watching this election process very closely, as one would imagine. But prior to this election cycle, they've always had questions and been confused about the role of Congress, and how our system works. And so it is essential that Biden or Trump be very assertive about pulling Congress into the process early on, perhaps even including them in track one level discussions.
Stephen, can I just jump in quickly on this point?
Please, Frank.
I think Keith has really made a very important observation. We know that North Korea pays attention to our political transitions, just like we pay attention to theirs. And I think that Biden in the Yonhap piece was really making an outreach not only to the South Korean people, but really to all the people on the Korean Peninsula. He was underscoring the importance of peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula to the United States, and also underscoring his willingness and his commitment to work toward those objectives if elected president. And Keith's right, COVID and the pandemic and the economic effect of it is going to be the top priority for Trump or Biden in January. There's no doubt in my mind. But we have a big government with great capabilities, and we can do more than one thing at the same time. And I can imagine no higher priority for a Biden administration, in East Asia than ensuring that the breakthrough summit in Singapore, which did establish a degree of rapport and a degree of calm on the peninsula, is not squandered, and that opportunity is followed up on. If for no other reason, then President Moon Jae-in, the clock is ticking on his term. And you've got a progressive president in Seoul committed to engagement and peace and denuclearization. You may have a Democratic president in Washington who shares those commitments, and time will be of the essence. So one of the advantages of electing someone like Joe Biden, he doesn't need training wheels, in the Oval Office. He's going to hit the ground running. He's going to have a good team around him. And I don't anticipate that you're going to have some lengthy delay in the process of moving forward with diplomacy in East Asia, whether that's, alliance first, and then consultations with, Seoul and Tokyo, Beijing, but in short order, the efforts to reach out to the North on a whole host of issues, to include the pandemic and the public health and the humanitarian response, that I think would be an appropriate way for the United States to begin dialogue with North Korea under a new presidency in Washington.
Yeah, and of course, Frank, given what you just said about the pandemic, that's an area, given South Korean capacity, where it seems that the U.S. administration will continue to turn, and where South Korea has been an important contributor to the United States. We at the Korea Society have done quite a bit on coronavirus in Korea, and I'd invite people to look at that at koreasociety.org. Frank, if I can turn to you and Keith for a last question before I turn to our audience questions with Jonathan Corrado. That question is about the personalities involved. And to be frank, some of the criticism that those who were active in the Obama-Biden administration will likely be back in place, perhaps elevated in different offices, and that we had at that time something called strategic patience, and that the North Koreans developed quite a bit during the period of strategic patience, both in terms of missile and nuclear capability. And that was North Korea's proclivity, but that patience may not have played out well. So it's a question about personalities and ways forward. I mean, do you think there are aspects, or is there a danger in falling back into a pattern of strategic patience? Or is there sort of a strategic patience to, or an uptick to a new policy? Because frankly, maybe after 4 US administrations, we haven't arrived at where we want to be, and that there may be new policy and new overtures that arrive at a better place for security on the peninsula.
Keith, you want to take this? This is a tough question. You want to take it, or should I?
Frank,
maybe I can get you both.
I will first defer to you. You are the former Biden official, very familiar with the Obama administration regarding strategic patience. So you please go first.
Well, thanks for the question, Stephen. Look, I have always been a little puzzled at why patience is a bad thing. It seems to me that most tough challenges require patience to solve. And whether that's tactical patience, strategic patience, beneficent, angelic patience, depends on the challenge you're facing. I think the Obama administration gets a little bit of a bum rap for being patient and avoiding calamity on the peninsula. It seems to me that they ought to receive a little credit for that. And North Korea, let's remember, North Korea didn't make engagement easy. It began with a missile test and a nuclear test in 2009, just months into the Obama-Biden administration, continued with the sinking of the Cheonan and shelling of Waipido at critical instances when the Obama administration was trying to get some traction in diplomacy. And Obama was dealing with two conservative presidents in Seoul, neither of whom were eager to see the United States take the lead in reaching out to Pyongyang. So I think we need to contextualize it a little bit. I would say that Biden's track record is one of a little bit of impatience. He likes to get shit done. And so he's not going to inherit a situation on the Korean Peninsula that is where he wants it to be. We have a North Korea that continues to enhance their nuclear capabilities. We have a North Korea that has been reluctant to follow up on repeated offers from Japan for engagement on the abduction issue. A North Korea that has walked back some of the Pyongyang Declaration cooperation arrangements with the South. And so these are not positive trend lines. And I think a Biden administration would want to reverse that and try to get the trajectory in a more positive direction. So I think he will show, if he becomes president, I think Biden will show the right measure of patience and impatience. And I'm not worried that he's going to be passive or sit around and think that time is going to improve the situation on the Korean Peninsula or move it in our favor. I would expect him to be a president of action.
Thank you, Frank. Keith, any additional thoughts on that, the
Yes.
possibility of new policy departures?
I would just say that given how administrations operate, I'm not certain that one can, whatever one may think of the strategic patience approach under President Obama to North Korea, I'm not certain that any blame associated with that can really be attached to the vice president. I would say that in my mind, the policy ultimately was not one of strategic patience overall. The Obama administration, for example, was not patient on the issue of human rights in North Korea. The Obama administration supported, promoted the UN Commission of Inquiry related to human rights. Ambassador Bob King was a key part of that. The Obama administration took a lead on designating Kim Jong-un as personally responsible for crimes against humanity, et cetera. That's not strategic patience. On the nuclear front, on the WMD front, I think it was more a policy of strategic acceptance. As North Korea continued to build its arsenal, there did seem to be, and I could be wrong about this as an outsider, there did seem to be a level of acceptance that North Korea is going to continue to do this, build their arsenal. So I would imagine that any of those who were with Mr. Obama and Biden on strategic patience, some of those will be advising the vice president if he's elected president. But I would imagine that those who are actually in the trenches would apply lessons learned from that experience to a new Biden approach to North Korea. At least I would hope that they would do so.
Thank you both. Let's turn to our audience questions. Jonathan?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We already have a lot of questions coming in, but please do continue to send them to policy@koreasociety.org. We love to hear from you and get your engagement. The first two questions I'm going to put together, and Keith and Frank, please feel free to address either or both as you so choose. Both imagine different scenarios. So in both of these scenarios, Biden is anticipated to be the winner. Sean King from Park Strategies, also an affiliated scholar at the University of Notre Dame, asks, if Biden is soon declared the winner, what might Trump try to do within this very short period of time that he has until inauguration on January 20th? And then Glenn Ford from Track 2 Asia asks, there's a similar small window that the Biden administration will have to work with President Moon Jae-in's administration. He leaves office at the end of March 22. So what can be accomplished during that time frame?
So Frank, may I respond first? And then
Please.
And greetings to Sean and Glenn both. Sean, in terms of in the event Mr. Biden is elected, what might President Trump still try to do? I would imagine that efforts by Deputy Secretary Biegun to negotiate with North Korea, I would imagine those efforts would continue between now and January 20. It's a personal opinion that the North Koreans have erred in not taking advantage of the open hand extended by Biegun. However, there are also these other signals coming out from the administration which sort of muddied the water. But I also want to point out here that as we look, whether it's under Trump or Biden, as we look toward providing assistance to North Korea as part of a package, it's important to point out, and this, Steve, goes back to one of your earlier remarks, that North Korea is rejecting US NGO assistance for COVID-19. And North Korea is saying no to US help. And so any thought of providing humanitarian support as part of a package short term is, I think, very unlikely. Frank?
Thanks, Keith. I agree with you that in the interregnum period, if Biden is elected, I would expect Biegun to make best efforts. He's a very diligent and talented diplomat. Biden would be wise even to consider keeping him on, in my humble opinion. But in any event, the idea that he would stop his efforts, I think, would be foolish. And if there could be some floor put under the process so as to give a Biden administration a little more time to build on that foundation, to prevent too much backsliding on the progress that has been made by the Trump administration in reaching out to the North, I think that would be time and energy well spent. As for Biden, he will be very much aware of the political clock, several clocks. His own clock, Moon Jae-in's clock, and the fact that diplomatic breakthroughs don't usually cellar well. They're a wine that is meant to be, it's a Beaujolais. You should enjoy it fresh. The Singapore summit document is not getting better with age. And we need to start moving on the commitments that are made in that document, including on the MIA recovery operations, which I think the North Koreans understand to be one of the many pathways towards normalization and improvement of relations with the United States. So the one caution I would say is that Biden will have learned, well, he has learned from time in Washington, and it's already hard baked into his DNA that we have only one president at a time. So what you won't see is any Biden machinations if he wins the presidency. You won't see any machinations by Biden from November till January in the foreign policy realm. His team is going to be focused on, recruiting personnel, getting their ducks in a row for after Inauguration Day. And we're going to have one president, from now until Inauguration Day, not two.
Thanks very much. We're now going to move on to a set of questions that deal with China. Myung-Koo Gong from Baruch College asks, how can we assess the Biden administration's potential approach to China? What will the policy be? Will it be more or less a continuation of the Trump administration's? And then my follow-on to that would be, how might this approach to China impact Korea's assessment of its security and trade interests? Will it be a big change from the current situation?
Keith, maybe I'd start on this one. I was in Seoul 2 weeks ago for the Mansfield Foundation and had an opportunity to discuss China at length with South Korean counterparts. And they all were extremely curious on this question. What I know of Biden's engagement with China is that it's actually been extraordinarily consistent over his career. He has supported China's full integration into the global community as an abiding the rules country, a country that would be what Robert Zoellick talked about as a responsible stakeholder. And so he has welcomed China's emergence as a major player because he has always predicated that on the idea that as China integrates with the world community, it will become more and more closely aligned with the norms on trade, on security, and on human rights. So that's been a consistent theme of Biden for the entirety of his time in public service, and it hasn't changed. What has changed is China. China's changed in many areas for the better and in some areas not. And especially in recent years, we have not seen China continuing to make progress on political reform, liberalization, and we've also seen continued frustration on everything from IPR protection to human rights. And so I think you can anticipate some similarities between Biden and Trump on China policy. That is to say that there will be criticism where China falls short of adhering to the global norms. But you'll also see differences. And one of the major differences is that Biden doesn't see the US-China relationship in Cold War terms. He doesn't see it in zero-sum, win-lose Cold War terms. And he doesn't expect our allies to view it that way either. So where a Trump administration might have tried to assemble, if you will, a China containment alliance network in the Asia Pacific, I think Biden would try to assemble a similar network, but with a different orientation, basically in defense of global norms and standards. An alliance network designed to enhance the liberal democratic order of open trade, adherence to human rights practices, and security. It may seem like a distinction without a difference, but I think there is a difference in that one is explicitly or implicitly anti-China, the Trump approach, and Biden's approach would not be. It would be saying to China, here are the rules, come play in the sandbox with us if you're willing to follow those rules.
I would, first of all, I would simply say that I think Frank provided a thorough overview of Biden's likely approach. I'm not certain it will work. I support Biden's approach, but there has been endless hope in recent years that China would come around on a variety of topics, some large, some small, business espionage, issuance of visas to US journalists, allowing the United States to place centers in China similar to the Confucius centers in the United States. And these are just a few things. And so the Biden line, and Senator Lugar, when he was in the Senate, took the same approach. We've got to engage with China. We've got to make certain they're part of the global community, et cetera, et cetera. Well, China has become part of the global community. And under Xi Jinping, they are going down a road different than what Mr. Biden and I think Lugar would have hoped. So I support Biden's approach, but I would also imagine, and Frank, maybe you can respond to this in a moment, I would also imagine that Biden would be willing to change course if need be, if this initial approach did not work out. But the China, this is an excellent question because the China factor is huge. You know, Mr. Trump went into office viewing China as the answer to the North Korea situation because of the massive assistance that China provides to North Korea. He learned that's not the case. It won't happen that way. China, in fact, will be a component of any long-term solution related to North Korea and the peninsula, but it in itself is not the answer. But this actually points to a broader area of concern, I think, for the United States. You know, in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia is increasingly squeezed by China and the US in terms of loyalty, one way or the other. Well, the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore recently released a survey of key leaders from throughout the 10 ASEAN countries. And out of 1,300 respondents, only 34% of key opinion leaders in Southeast Asia had some or full confidence in the United States as a strategic partner, and only 24% believe that the United States would provide leadership to maintain the rules-based order and uphold international law. So I say this because Frank's approach, if adopted by Biden, if that's what he does, great. That's the model. That's what we hope to achieve. But a lot of work's going to have to be done in terms of bringing China around, and a lot of work's going to have to be done in terms of reassuring the region as relates to what the United States is about and how serious we are about these things. So Frank.
Very briefly. Thanks so much, Keith. I think you put it better than I did. That lack of confidence in the U.S. commitment, and the U.S. commitment especially even to the liberal democratic order that we were responsible in helping to build among our friends and partners, especially in Southeast Asia, is what I was trying to address in sort of anticipating a Biden recommitment to those norms. But I think your other point is also important, which is that even if your objectives remain the same vis-a-vis China with respect to trying to compel them or encourage them to abide by the norms, your tactics have to change as China changes. And Biden's already signaled a much more muscular approach, especially on security issues, whether that's the East China Sea in terms of laying down a commitment to the US-Japan alliance, or freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, or more outspoken public criticism of China's human rights record, whether it be Hong Kong or Xinjiang. So I think you could anticipate, or one should anticipate, a more muscular style of engagement. But I think where the difference would be is that I think Biden also understands, and Tony Blinken made this clear when he appeared in a Fareed Zakaria show a couple months ago, there are areas where we need to work with China on climate change, on North Korea, peace and denuclearization. So if you shut off those avenues where you can find some common ground with Beijing, you're really not doing yourselves any favors. So I think this is why China policy is going to be so challenging for whoever becomes president, whether it's Trump or Biden, because we're dealing with a more capable rich, powerful, politically and militarily, economically significant China than we've dealt with ever before. And the tactics are going to have to adapt.
Thanks so much. Okay, we're going to transition now to a question from Professor Stephen Haggard from the University of California, San Diego. Professor Haggard asks, perhaps the central policy question for a Biden administration is whether he will be willing to accept an interim sanctions relief deal, either multilaterally or preferably through South Korea. So interim sanctions relief in the cards or not?
Hey, Steph, I could count on you always to give us tough questions. Something about that West Coast air. But I can't answer your question. I certainly can't speak for the Biden administration, but what I can say is that I think Steve Biegun's approach, where he signaled that North Korea doesn't have to do everything in order for the United States to do something, that is a practical, realistic, honest assessment of how diplomacy with North Korea is likely to work. And there will be lots of haggling over how much the North has to do and how much the United States and South Korea need to do in response. But the notion that we're going to extract from North Korea maximum concession while giving nothing on things of interest to them is not realistic. That's not diplomacy. That's just coercion. I remember Bob Gallucci, Keith, appeared before our committee once testifying about the agreed framework and those who were critical of it. And defending the agreement, he said, remember, senators, you didn't send me off to the North Koreans to negotiate their surrender. If you wanted to empower me to negotiate their surrender, you needed to beat them in the war first. I went to negotiate a deal, which meant that both parties had to get something of value. So I don't know if that answers your question, Steph, but I would expect, especially on the humanitarian side, that there would be room for movement. But in terms of the UN sanctions regime, that's a tougher issue.
Steph, I join Frank in expressing greetings to you. Personally, I'm of the opinion that sanctions relief of some sort will likely be on the table within the next year, regardless of who's in the White House. Sanctions have not stopped the development of North Korea's nuclear program. Sanctions, in fact, the imposition of sanctions by the United Nations, by the United States, by the executive branch, by the Congress, while well-intended and with the hope of impacting North Korea's behavior, the sanctions and the extent of sanctions have led to unintended consequences. Now, let's take a look for a moment at the extent of North Korea's cyber force they've assembled now. Thousands of people who are involved in direct cyber assaults on the United States, throughout the world, et cetera. This is partly in response to sanctions. Now, having said that, North Korea's got to do its part. And Kim Jong-un will need to be able to demonstrate to President Biden or to President Trump what he's willing to do to move further down the road. But, he has a problem. Kim Jong-un has not delivered sanctions relief of any sort at this point to those around him. And so after meeting with Mr. Trump, Singapore, Hanoi, he went home empty-handed, which I believe has impacted his own operating space within North Korea. And so while sanctions relief, I believe, will be on the table, it may occur to some degree. Not only is the United States going to be wary, Kim Jong-un is going to be very wary as to whether or not we will actually carry out such a promise. He has gone out on a limb in terms of the hardliners around him as relates to the extent of his engagement with President Trump on a personal basis. And so I believe that there will be a willingness in the future to consider this, but it's a road which is shadowed by peril along the way for either side.
Okay, we've got time for just two more questions. Thanks everybody for sending in So many great comments and questions. We really appreciate it. This one is coming from So Young An at Voice of America. So Young asks, what kind of advice would you give to the next administration to get substantive progress with North Korea's nuclear deal? I know we've covered this issue a little bit, but if you have any additional comments just in terms of what different might be done going forward.
I'd tell them to hire Keith Luse.
Frank, you need to finish your remarks. Take a drink. Take a drink and continue.
That's just coffee, Keith. It's still morning here.
All right.
Yeah. So Young, thank you. It's a good question. I don't mean to make light of it. In fact, people matter, and people of Keith's caliber should be brought into the administration if they were willing to serve. And I think the best advice that I could offer to the Biden administration, if we're going to have a Biden administration, is to seize the day. That peacemaking requires effort. It's the job of diplomats to turn the impossible into the very unlikely. If it were easy to make peace and denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, we would have done it long ago. It's not easy. It's hard, and we're dealing from a position of deep mistrust. So the way to alleviate mistrust is by getting to know each other and making commitments to one another, and then fulfilling those commitments one after another. It's a trust building process. And so the sooner you start that, the better off you'll be, and the more time you'll have to get something meaningful accomplished during Biden's first of 4 terms. I think he's planning to serve, right, Keith?
So it's an important question. And as Frank has stated, it's complex, it's challenging. It's my own opinion that denuclearization of North Korea is eventually possible, but not by going through the front door. Denuclearization of North Korea could become part of a broader policy approach, whether you want to call it arms control or other possibilities. The North Koreans, they, just like South Korea, they have the shadow of invasions from the past. That's not lost on them, whether we're talking about Chinese incursions into Korea going back to 300 BC, the Mongols, the Japanese, you have the Korean War. And so Kim Jong-un is quite serious about preserving his country as well as his own leadership in that country. So denuclearization will need to be part of a broader package. It is possible, I believe, over time. But we must keep in mind that as Americans, I will often think of North Korea and denuclearization in the bilateral context. Well, Kim Jong-un, because of history, because of other dynamics, he views us as simply part of this larger challenge that he has of balancing China, Russia, South Korea, and on and on. And any of those countries may be a friend for a day, but he knows based upon experience that he is responsible for sustaining the existence of North Korea. So this gets back to Frank's point about personal relationship with Biden, personal relationship with Trump. That personal relationship, I believe, can help pave the way for a broader approach to North Korea, including denuclearization.
Thanks so much. And before I move on to the last question, I do want to mention that the comedy duo of Frank and Keith is available for hire. They do weddings, bar mitzvahs, corporate retreats. Just give them a shout out. I'll come and bring their levity to any situation. The last question comes from Mia Tanaka. She's from Kyoto News, and she wants to know about the kidnapping issue. So President Trump raised the issue during a summit with Kim Jong-un, but there was no substantial progress thereafter. Still, it was welcomed as a gesture in Japan. Going forward, do you think that a Biden administration would highlight the issue?
You want to talk about our joint efforts on this?
You go first.
Well, during his years in the Senate, Biden worked closely with Senator Lugar and Senator Helms, Senator Brownback, and others to try to make sure that the United States never forgot the abduction issue, because we know how important it is to our allies in Japan. And when Keith and I traveled to the North, I'm not revealing any secrets to say that we never failed to raise this issue with North Korean interlocutors persistently, and always encouraging them to reach out to Japan to work with the Japanese government to seek a resolution of the case of the abductees. And Keith and I also met on a bipartisan basis with the families of those who have been abducted to signal the congressional support, not just the executive branch, but also the congressional support for this issue. And of course, there are many American families that were separated by the war, not through abduction, but who have family members in the North, and many South Koreans who were either abducted or who fled to the North, perhaps misguided in hoping it was going to be something different than it was. And those families are also separated. So the human dimension of the problem on the Korean Peninsula should not be ignored in the pursuit of denuclearization. In fact, I would argue that the people-to-people human security dimension, including the abduction issue, as tough as it is, offers a pathway to trust building and communication. The sad truth is that I don't believe that North Korea is interested in pursuing this issue with Japan absent progress in both North-South relations and US-DPRK relations. It's kind of a package deal. So the sooner the United States works with South Korea and Japan to build a comprehensive peace mechanism, a peace process on the Korean Peninsula, the more likely we are to see progress on the abduction issue. And maybe I should leave it there. Keith?
I would just add that if you are among leaders in Japan dealing with foreign policy, you have a quandary, because you know, sitting in Tokyo, that North Korean missiles can hit Japan. A lot of people in Japan could die as a result of North Korean attacks. At the same time, to the credit of former Prime Minister Abe, this issue was one that he flagged earlier on in his career. Frank and I both met with him on one occasion. Frank, I know, met with him other times. Abe is the reason that this issue has really remained active. I'm hopeful that Japanese leaders will continue to emphasize the importance of this issue. I'm hopeful that as the relatives, many of whom are elderly, I'm hopeful that as they pass on, that the Japanese government will continue to make this issue a priority with North Korea. And to the credit of Prime Minister Abe, it's my understanding that up until the recent past, he had continued to work behind the scenes in an effort to resolve this issue with North Korea. And for all I know, he may end up in the future somehow playing a role in this issue again.
Yeah, and if I could just add, Jonathan, I know time is short, but I think what the Japanese government has begun to appreciate about this problem is that there is a difference between getting full cooperation from the North Korean government towards getting answers. There's a difference between that full cooperation and getting all the answers. And this is a hard lesson that Americans learned with Vietnam, where we still have MIA in Vietnam that we haven't recovered from the Vietnam War. But what we have expected of the Vietnamese is their full cooperation toward the objective, even knowing that we may never get all the answers to what happened to those American pilots and soldiers, in Vietnam that we would like to have for the families. And I think the reality is that Japan is in a similar quandary with North Korea, and that we may never, tragically, get all the answers that we want about what happened to Japanese who were abducted by North Korea. But the people of Japan have every right to expect full cooperation from the North Korean government toward the objective. And I think that there's a growing awareness of this in Tokyo. And hopefully that will allow the nations to engage in a way that could yield some meaningful results.
And Jonathan, if I could just quickly add, Frank's example also applies to Americans still unaccounted for from the war in Korea.
Yep.
A few thousand individuals. And so the same dynamics, the same challenges apply to that topic as well.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Keith, and thank you, Frank. We're very grateful to have had you here today. We are at the top of the hour, and we're grateful to both of you. It's great to have you back, having had you here for the post-Singapore Summit meeting that we discussed at 350 Madison. Thank you for your patience and all of your kind insights online today for this discussion of the impact of the election on Korea and Asia policy. It's really been a rich and fruitful discussion. And thank you both for what you do. Thank you, Frank, for your good efforts with the Mansfield Foundation and its important role in educating Congress and the public on the importance of East Asia. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have a special relationship with the Mansfield Center in Missoula, Montana. Our high school students in Project Bridge are participating, those from Missoula, as well as those from New York and those from Los Angeles in visiting Korea. And there's information up on that at koreasociety.org. And Keith, thank you for all of the great efforts of the National Committee on North Korea and your leadership at NCNK. Much more information at ncnk.org. We're very grateful again to have had you. Thank you to all of you who have joined us online or who are listening via podcast or viewing via YouTube video. We invite you back for a mid-month discussion on sanctions, and we will be back on December 3rd to discuss next steps on North Korea policy all the more. Thank you as well to those of you who joined on October 1st for the first part, looking ahead at the election and what some possibilities for Asia policy might be, that with Susan Thornton and Danny Russell. So Frank Jannuzi, Keith Luse, thank you so much for being with us here at the Korea Society, and we look forward to welcoming you back. And I might hasten to add that we appreciate your kind support for our United Nations program to support cooperation in Northeast Asia. You both had very distinguished roles in helping us do that series for senior personnel at the UN. Thanks for your time here today, and thanks for your continued engagement with the Korea Society.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Thank you, Keith. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan, Tom.